Sometimes the family we barely knew leaves us the biggest surprises. When you've lived alone in the mountains for years, with only your dog for company, you learn to expect very little from the world beyond your doorstep. That's exactly how Ruth McKenzie felt when she got the letter about inheriting her uncle's old fire tower. At 58, she figured it would be nothing more than rotting wood and rusted metal. So she packed up her German Shepherd Scout and headed up the mountain to see what Uncle Henry had left behind. What she found changed everything. Hidden journals, strange maps, and equipment that didn't belong in any fire tower she'd ever seen. Her uncle wasn't just watching for fires. He was guarding something much bigger. What secret had Uncle Henry been protecting all those years in that lonely tower? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ruth McKenzie had built her life around the rhythm of silence. For 15 years, her cabin had sat nestled in a grove of Douglas firs, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor and 40 from the closest town. The morning mist clung to the valley below like a familiar blanket, and the only sounds were the gentle creak that wound past her porch and Scout's occasional contented sighs as he dozed in his favorite patch of sunlight. She hadn't always lived this way. There was a time when her days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and the constant hum of city life. But that was before Michael died, before the cancer took him slowly and deliberately, one painful day at a time. After the funeral, after watching their friends struggle to find the right words, after enduring months of well-meaning visitors who couldn't understand that sometimes grief needed space to breathe, Ruth had made a choice. She sold their house in Portland, bought this remote property, and disappeared into the mountains with Scout, a rescue dog who seemed to understand that some wounds healed better in quiet places. The morning the letter arrived, Ruth was splitting firewood behind her cabin. Scout lay nearby, his dark eyes following each swing of her axe with the patient attention of a dog who had learned to find entertainment in simple routines. At 68 pounds of pure German Shepherd loyalty, Scout had been her constant companion for the past 8 years. She'd found him at the shelter just months after Michael's death, a 3-year-old whose previous owners had surrendered him for being too protective. Ruth had taken one look at his intelligent brown eyes and known they belonged. Together, the postal truck's approach broke the morning calm, and visitais, unusual occurrence that sent Scout to his feet. Alert but not alarmed, rural mail delivery came twice a week at most, and Ruth rarely received anything more interesting than utility bills or the occasional catalogue. "Morning," Ruth called Tom Brennan, the postal carrier who'd been serving this route for over 2 decades. He was one of the few people Ruth spoke with regularly, their conversations limited to weather observations and updates on his grandchildren. "Got something official looking for you today." The envelope bore the letterhead of Morrison, Kessler and Associates, attorneys at law from Seattle. Ruth turned it over in her hands, noting the weight of expensive paper and the careful precision of her typed address. She couldn't remember the last time she'd received legal correspondence. "Probably trying to sell me something," she told Scout. But the dog's tilted head suggested he wasn't buying her casual tone. Inside her cabin, Ruth settled into the worn leather chair that had been Michael's favorite. Scout positioning himself at her feet with the protective instincts that never quite left him. The letter was brief and formal, but its contents made her read it 3 times before the words fully registered. "Dear Ms. McKenzie, we regret to inform you of the death of Henry McKenzie, who passed away on March 15th at the age of 79. According to his last will and testament, you have been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate. Specifically, his property located at GPS coordinates 47.721 Glasdagn, 121.1531 W, including all structures and contents therein. Mr. Mackenzie's property consists of a fire lookout tower and surrounding acreage in the Cascade National Forest. We have enclosed the deed transfer documents and ask that you contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange for property inspection and transfer." completion. Please accept our condolences for your loss. Sincerely, James Morrison. Escort Ruth stared at the letter, her mind struggling to place Uncle Henry in her family history. Henry McKenzie. She remembered him vaguely from childhood, a tall, quiet man who appeared at family gatherings like a ghost, staying long enough to be polite before disappearing back to whatever solitary life he led in the mountains. Her father had mentioned him occasionally, always with a mixture of respect and concern, describing his older brother as someone who'd never quite found his place in the ordinary world after returning from Vietnam. He keeps to himself up there, her father used to say, always watching, always listening. What changed him, but maybe the mountains are helping him heal. Ruth had been perhaps 12 the last time she'd seen Uncle Henry at her grandmother's funeral. He'd worn his dress uniform, she remembered, and had stood apart from the family during the service, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting trouble. Even then, she'd sensed something different about him, a wariness that seemed to extend beyond ordinary caution. Now he was gone, and somehow he'd remembered her enough to leave her his property. It seemed impossible that she, of all his relatives, would be his choice. She had cousins who still lived in Washington, siblings who might have seemed more logical inheritors. Why her? Scout whined softly, sensing her confusion, and Ruth reached down to scratch behind his ears. What do you think, boy? Should we go see what Uncle Henry left us? The coordinates in the letter were roughly 60 miles northeast of her cabin, deep in national forest land, where fire towers had once served as the eyes and ears of wilderness protection. Most had been abandoned decades ago, replaced by satellite technology and aerial surveillance. The idea that Uncle Henry had been living in one seemed both romantic and utterly impractical. Over the next few days, Ruth found herself returning to the letter repeatedly, reading between its formal lines for clues about Uncle Henry's life and death. She called the law firm twice, speaking with a pleasant secretary who could provide only basic information. Henry McKenzie had lived alone, had no apparent debts or complications, and had left specific instructions that the property be transferred to Ruth with minimal delay. Was he sick? Ruth asked during her second call. I'm sorry, but Mr. Morrison can't discuss the specifics of Mr. Mackenzie's death, the secretary replied. I can tell you that all legal requirements have been met and the transfer is straightforward. The property is yours, Ms. McKenzie. Ruth spent an evening researching fire towers online, learning about their history and construction. Most were built in the 1930s and 1940s, typically standing 40 to 60 feet tall, with panoramic views of the surrounding forest. They'd been staffed by dedicated watchers who lived in isolation for months at a time, scanning the horizon for the first wisps of smoke that might signal a dangerous wildfire. The work required a special kind of person, someone comfortable with solitude, meticulous in observation, and capable of functioning independently in challenging conditions. It sounded, Ruth realized, exactly like the kind of life that would appeal to someone seeking refuge from a world that had become too complicated or painful to navigate. She began planning the trip to Uncle Henry's tower, gathering supplies and studying topographical maps. The coordinates placed it in rugged terrain, accessible only by hiking trail and requiring at least a day's journey from the nearest forest service road. It would be challenging for a woman approaching 60, but Ruth had maintained her fitness through years of mountain living. Scout, despite being middle-aged in dog years, remained strong and sure-footed on difficult terrain. 3 days before her planned departure, Ruth made a discovery that deepened the mystery surrounding her inheritance. While organizing her father's papers, a task she'd been avoiding since his death 2 years earlier, she found a small wooden box containing military medals, commendations, and a faded photograph of 2 young soldiers in Vietnam-era uniforms. One was clearly her father, at perhaps 25, his familiar smile unchanged by the decades that would follow. The other was Uncle Henry, but not the quiet, distant man she remembered from family gatherings. This Henry McKenzie wore the focused expression of someone accustomed to life and death decisions, his eyes sharp with intelligence and determination. Across the bottom of the photograph, someone had written in neat military script, H. McKenzie Special Operations, 1969, Special Operations. Ruth had assumed Uncle Henry was a regular infantry soldier, but this suggested something more specialized, more dangerous. She studied his face in the photograph, noting the way he held himself slightly apart, even while standing beside his brother, as if maintaining some invisible perimeter of awareness. Among the papers, she found a single letter in her father's handwriting, apparently never sent. Henry, I know you won't talk about what happened over there, and I respect that. But I want you to know that whatever you did, whatever you had to do, it doesn't change who you are to this family. The mountains are good for healing, but don't let them become a prison. We're here when you're ready. Your brother, Frank. The letter was dated 1975, 6 years after Uncle Henry's return from Vietnam. Ruth felt a pang of sadness for both brothers, one trying to reach out, the other apparently too wounded or wary to accept the connection. Now, decades later, Uncle Henry had reached out to her in the only way he knew how, through the inheritance of his most private refuge. The gesture felt both generous and somehow desperate, as if he'd been carrying something too heavy to bear alone, and hoped she might understand what others could not. As Ruth prepared for the journey to the fire tower, she found herself wondering what secrets Uncle Henry had carried into his mountain solitude, and why he'd chosen her to inherit whatever remained of his closely guarded life. The trail to Uncle Henry's fire tower began at a forgotten Forest Service road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Ruth parked her truck beside a weathered sign that read Tower Trail, 6.2 miles in faded letters, the metal surface pocked with bullet holes from target practice by hunters or bored teenagers. Scout emerged from the passenger seat with the eager alertness of a dog who recognized adventure in the making. Ruth shouldered her pack, heavy with camping supplies, food for 2 days, and the various tools she'd thought might be useful for inspecting an abandoned building. The morning air carried the crisp bite of early autumn, and dew still clung to the ferns that lined the trail's edges. This was her element, the quiet forests where cell phones held no signal, and the only deadlines were those imposed by weather and daylight. The first 3 miles passed through dense timber, the trail well maintained despite its apparent abandonment. Ruth noticed this with growing curiosity. Forest Service trails required regular clearing to remain passable, but this path showed signs of recent maintenance. Fallen trees had been cut and moved aside, brush had been trimmed back, and water bars had been recently cleared to prevent erosion. Scout ranged ahead with practiced ease, his nose working the air currents for information Ruth couldn't access. Occasionally he would pause, his ears pricked forward, before continuing with the satisfied air of a dog whose investigations had yielded acceptable results. Ruth had learned to trust Scout's instincts completely. His protective nature had evolved beyond simple loyalty into something approaching supernatural awareness of potential threats. As they climbed higher, the forest began to thin, offering glimpses of the surrounding peaks through breaks in the canopy. Ruth's pace remained steady despite the increasing elevation. Years of mountain living had maintained her conditioning even as she approached 60. The familiar rhythm of hiking meditation settled over her, the simple forward motion that had always been her most reliable form of prayer. At mile 4, the trail took a sharp turn around a massive boulder, and Ruth caught her first glimpse of Uncle Henry's fire tower rising above the tree line ahead. Even from a distance, something seemed wrong with the picture. The tower appeared far too well maintained for an abandoned structure, its wooden frame showing none of the weathering and decay she'd expected. Scout's behavior changed as they approached the tower's base. His relaxed ranging became focused circling, nose to the ground as he worked scent patterns with the intensity Ruth recognized from his protection training. Whatever he was detecting made him uneasy, though not alarmed, more like a guard dog checking the perimeter of familiar territory. The fire tower stood 60 feet tall, its wooden construction following the classic design Ruth had researched online. 4 massive legs supported a small cabin at the top, accessed by a series of stairs that zigzagged up the framework. What struck her immediately was the tower's condition. The wood showed signs of regular maintenance, the stairs appeared solid and safe, and the windows of the upper cabin gleamed with recent cleaning. Ruth circled the tower's base, looking for signs of Uncle Henry's presence. She found them immediately, a well-worn path leading to a small outbuilding that had been invisible from the trail approach, a neat stack of split firewood covered by a tarp, and a vegetable garden that, while overgrown, showed evidence of care within the past growing season. The outbuilding revealed itself to be a surprisingly comfortable cabin, perhaps 12 by 16 feet, with a stone chimney and windows that looked out over the valley below. The door was secured with a simple padlock, but the key, according to a note in the lawyer's packet, should be hidden beneath a loose stone in the chimney foundation. Ruth found the key exactly where indicated, which raised new questions about how recently Uncle Henry had prepared for her arrival. The lawyer had been vague about the timing of his death, but the precision of these arrangements suggested planning rather than emergency. The cabin's interior took Ruth's breath away. What she'd expected to be rustic frontier living revealed itself as the carefully organized headquarters of someone engaged in serious, ongoing work. The walls were covered with topographical maps, some marked with colored pins and notations in Uncle Henry's precise handwriting. A desk built from rough planks held multiple notebooks, their leather covers worn smooth by years of handling. But it was the equipment that made Ruth's breath catch. Along one wall stood electronic devices she couldn't identify. Radio equipment, perhaps, but far more sophisticated than anything she'd seen in civilian use. Multiple antennas extended from the roof, and a complex battery system suggested power capabilities well beyond simple cabin needs. Scout whined softly from the doorway, his reluctance to enter the cabin clear in his body language. Ruth respected his instincts enough to prop the door open before beginning her investigation, ensuring they could exit quickly if his concerns proved justified. The notebooks drew her attention first. Uncle Henry's handwriting was precise, almost military in its economy, and the earliest entries were dated nearly 30 years ago. Ruth opened one at random and found herself reading what appeared to be surveillance notes. July 15th, 1994, black helicopter. No markings, circled Sector 7 for 20 minutes before heading southeast. Third sighting this month. Pattern suggests regular patrol rather than search activity. July 18th, 1994, hiking party. 4 adults, reported missing by family. Last seen entering trail system 2.5 miles northwest of Tower. Forest Service claims no knowledge of missing persons report. July 22nd, 1994, missing hiker's vehicle found abandoned at Murphy Creek trailhead. No search and rescue operation initiated despite family requests. Local authorities cite jurisdictional confusion. Ruth flipped through more pages, finding similar entries stretching across decades. Missing persons reports that seemed to disappear into bureaucratic voids. Unusual aircraft activity. Government vehicles in areas supposedly restricted to wilderness access. The picture that emerged was of Uncle Henry functioning as an unofficial watchman, documenting patterns that suggested something deeply wrong in these mountains. The maps on the walls told the same story in visual form. Red pins marked locations where people had disappeared. Blue pins indicated unusual aircraft sightings. Yellow pins showed areas where Uncle Henry had noted restricted access, despite being within public forest boundaries. The concentration of pins in certain areas created clear patterns, corridors of activity that seemed to follow terrain features unsuitable for normal recreational use. Ruth pulled down one of the maps for closer inspection. It covered roughly 50 square miles of mountainous terrain, with Uncle Henry's notations covering nearly every inch. In the margin, he'd written coordinates and dates, creating a comprehensive database of unusual activity. One notation caught her attention immediately: Project Clearwater, Evidence suggests ongoing operation. Estimated 40-plus missing persons over 25-year period. Pattern indicates systematic rather than random disappearances. Project Clearwater. The name meant nothing to Ruth, but the clinical precision of Uncle Henry's documentation suggested it meant everything to him. She found herself holding the accumulated observations of a man who'd spent decades collecting evidence of something terrible happening in these mountains. Scout's sharp bark from outside the cabin broke her concentration. Ruth dropped the map and moved quickly to the door, where she found her dog standing rigid, staring down the trail they'd climbed to reach the tower. His body language spoke of alert attention rather than immediate threat. But Ruth had learned to take his warning seriously. She saw nothing unusual, just the forest trail disappearing into the shadows of dense timber. But Scout's training had been extensive, and his senses detected threats long before they became visible to human observation. Someone or something was moving on the trail below, and Scout's assessment suggested it wasn't the casual passage of other hikers. Ruth made a quick decision. She gathered the most recent notebooks, rolled up the most detailed map, and secured the cabin as she'd found it. Whatever Uncle Henry had been documenting, whatever Project Clearwater represented, she needed time and safety to understand its implications. The tower itself could wait. Scout's behavior suggested that discovery might come with risks she wasn't prepared to face unprepared. As they descended the trail, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that her inheritance was far more complicated than abandoned property. Uncle Henry hadn't just left her a fire tower, he'd left her a mission, complete with evidence of crimes that powerful people had spent decades keeping hidden. The question now was whether she had the courage to continue his work, or the wisdom to walk away from secrets that might be too dangerous to uncover. Ruth spent 3 sleepless nights studying Uncle Henry's notebooks before returning to the fire tower. Each page revealed new layers of a conspiracy that seemed to stretch back decades, involving missing persons, government cover-ups, and systematic suppression of evidence. The precision of his documentation was both impressive and deeply unsettling. This wasn't the work of a paranoid hermit, but of someone with professional intelligence training methodically building a case. Scout seemed to sense her growing unease. He stayed closer than usual, positioning himself where he could watch both Ruth and the approaches to her cabin. His protective instincts had been honed by years of living with someone who understood that isolation meant self-reliance. But his current behavior suggested threats more serious than the occasional black bear or mountain lion. The second trip to the tower was planned with military precision that would have made Uncle Henry proud. Ruth packed lighter but brought specific tools: a digital camera to document everything, a GPS unit to verify coordinates, and a small crowbar in case she needed to access areas that weren't immediately obvious. She also brought provisions to stay overnight in the tower itself. If she was going to understand Uncle Henry's work, she needed to experience his perspective. This time, Ruth climbed directly to the tower's observation cabin, rather than limiting herself to the ground-level quarters. The stairs were solid beneath her feet, recently maintained like everything else about the structure. Scout followed reluctantly, his discomfort with heights balanced by his unwillingness to let Ruth venture alone into unknown territory. The observation cabin took Ruth's breath away. Through windows that provided a 360-degree view of the surrounding mountains, she could see for miles in every direction. But it wasn't the vista that shocked her. It was the equipment that filled the small space. The cabin contained surveillance technology that belonged in a government facility, not an abandoned fire tower. Multiple radio systems, some with frequency ranges she didn't recognize. Computer equipment running on solar power, supplemented by battery banks. Most disturbing of all, a series of monitoring screens that displayed real-time feeds from cameras positioned throughout the forest. Ruth activated one of the systems and found herself looking at trail cameras positioned at key points throughout the mountains. The feeds were live, showing current weather and wildlife activity, but the camera positions weren't random. They covered the exact areas where Uncle Henry's maps showed the highest concentration of disappearances and unusual activity. Scout paced nervously around the small cabin, clearly agitated by something Ruth couldn't detect. His behavior suggested familiar territory. He'd been here before, knew the space, but associated it with tension and alertness rather than comfort. Ruth spent hours going through Uncle Henry's more recent notes, finding entries that made her blood run cold. March 10th, large convoy movement through Sector 12, military vehicles with no identifying markings. Estimated 20-plus personnel. Movement pattern suggests transport rather than patrol. March 12th, missing persons report filed for Seattle family. Last seen entering National Forest at Cascade River Trailhead. VIT's established pattern for demographic targeting. March 14th, aerial surveillance confirms underground facility construction in Sector 12. Heavy equipment access via unofficial roads. No environmental impact permits on file with Forest Service. The dates were recent, within weeks of Uncle Henry's supposed death. Either he'd been documenting activity right up until the end, or someone else had been using his equipment to continue the surveillance. Given the precision and consistency of the handwriting, Ruth suspected the former. She found Uncle Henry's personal log in a locked drawer, the key hidden in the same practical manner as everything else about his operation. The entries here were more personal, revealing the emotional toll of his decades-long vigil. I've watched them take 43 people over 25 years. Families destroyed, lives erased, truth buried under layers of bureaucratic denial. The weight of this knowledge becomes heavier each year, but someone has to bear witness. Someone has to remember their names. Ruth showed promise even as a child. Quiet, observant, strong enough to live alone, but principled enough to act when action is required. If something happens to me, she's the only family member I trust to continue this work. The evidence speaks for itself. She'll understand what needs to be done. Ruth's hands trembled as she read Uncle Henry's assessment of her character. He'd been planning this inheritance for years, watching her from a distance, evaluating whether she had the strength to carry on his mission. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but his confidence in her capabilities created an obligation she couldn't easily dismiss. The afternoon brought the first direct evidence that Uncle Henry's concerns were justified. While reviewing camera feeds from the valley below, Ruth spotted movement that made her reach for the binoculars Uncle Henry kept mounted near the main observation window. 3 men in civilian clothes were hiking up the trail toward the tower, but their movement patterns were all wrong for casual hikers. They moved with tactical precision, spacing themselves for mutual support, checking sight lines and potential ambush points with professional awareness. These weren't lost tourists or enthusiastic backpackers. They were operators conducting reconnaissance. Scout's behavior intensified, his protective instincts triggered by threats that were now visible to Ruth as well. He positioned himself between Ruth and the stairway, ready to defend or escape as the situation demanded. Ruth made quick decisions based on Uncle Henry's training protocols, which she found outlined in a laminated card taped inside a desk drawer. She powered down all electronic equipment except the essential communication gear, secured the most critical evidence in a hidden compartment Uncle Henry had built into the cabin's floor, and prepared for either confrontation or rapid departure. The men reached the tower's base and began a systematic search of the area. Ruth watched through carefully positioned mirrors that allowed observation without exposing herself at the windows. Their search was professional, thorough, and clearly based on prior knowledge of the site's layout. One of them carried communication equipment that suggested coordination with off-site personnel. Another had the bearing and movement patterns Ruth recognized from her brief experience with military contractors who'd worked on Forest Service projects near her cabin. The third seemed focused on electronic surveillance, carrying detection equipment designed to locate radio signals and recording devices. They spent nearly an hour examining the tower and surrounding buildings before moving on, but their presence confirmed Uncle Henry's warnings about the dangers of his work. Someone was monitoring the site, aware of its significance, and prepared to take action against anyone who might continue Uncle Henry's documentation efforts. As evening approached and the men disappeared down the trail, Ruth realized she faced a crucial decision. She could gather Uncle Henry's evidence, turn it over to appropriate authorities, and return to her peaceful mountain life. Or she could accept the responsibility he'd placed on her shoulders and continue the dangerous work of documenting crimes that powerful people desperately wanted to keep hidden. Scout's steady presence reminded her that whatever choice she made, she wouldn't face it alone. Uncle Henry had trained him not just as a pet, but as a partner in a mission that was bigger than any individual. The question now was whether Ruth had the courage to accept that partnership and all its implications. Ruth's decision crystallized during her second night in the tower cabin. As darkness settled over the mountains, she found herself studying the most disturbing evidence Uncle Henry had collected, a hidden cache of government documents that revealed Project Clearwater in horrifying detail. The files were stored in a waterproof container built into the cabin's foundation, accessible only through a hidden panel that required specific knowledge to locate. Uncle Henry's instructions for finding it were coded into what appeared to be maintenance notes, visible only to someone who understood his organizational system. Project Clearwater, according to the documents, had begun in the 1970s as a classified research program designed to test psychological and pharmaceutical manipulation techniques on unwilling subjects. The program required isolated test sites and expendable subjects, criteria that made the national forests perfect laboratories and vulnerable hikers' ideal research material. Ruth read through reports that described human experimentation with the clinical detachment of scientific literature. But the subjects weren't volunteers in controlled environments. They were families on camping trips, solo hikers seeking wilderness solitude, hunters who'd wandered too far from established trails, people who could disappear without generating the kind of publicity that might threaten program security. The scope of the operation was staggering. Multiple sites across several national forests, coordinated activities involving military personnel and civilian contractors, systematic suppression of missing persons investigations, and bureaucratic structures designed to ensure that evidence never reached appropriate oversight. Authorities, Uncle Henry's own background became clear through files that documented his recruitment and subsequent disillusionment with the program. As a Special Forces veteran with extensive experience in covert operations, he'd been brought into Project Clearwater as a security consultant. His job had been to ensure site security and manage evidence disposal, work that required someone comfortable with moral ambiguity and capable of maintaining operational secrecy. But Uncle Henry's conscience hadn't survived contact with the reality of what Project Clearwater represented. His military service had involved killing, but it had been honest killing, enemy combatants who posed legitimate threats to American forces. Project Clearwater involved the systematic torture and murder of innocent civilians in the name of research that violated every principle he'd sworn to protect. His transformation from participant to witness to active opponent was documented in personal notes that revealed a man wrestling with guilt over his complicity and determination to expose the truth regardless of personal cost. He'd begun keeping records in 1975, initially as insurance against being scapegoated if the program was exposed. By 1980, he'd become a dedicated documenter of evidence that might someday bring the perpetrators to justice. The files contained names, dates, organizational structures, and financial records that provided a comprehensive picture of a criminal conspiracy that had operated for decades with impunity. But they also contained something more valuable, evidence that Project Clearwater was still active, still claiming victims, still protected by the same networks of official denial that had enabled its original implementation. Scout's sudden alertness broke Ruth's concentration on the documents. His body language indicated immediate threat, not the distant concern he'd shown during the day, but the focused intensity that preceded direct confrontation. Someone was approaching the tower under cover of darkness, moving with stealth that suggested hostile intent. Ruth powered down her flashlight and moved to the observation windows using night vision equipment Uncle Henry had provided. 3 figures were climbing toward the tower, but these weren't the daytime reconnaissance team. Their equipment and movement patterns suggested direct action rather than surveillance. They were here to secure the site and eliminate potential witnesses. The realization hit Ruth with crystal clarity. Uncle Henry's death hadn't been natural. He'd been eliminated because his documentation threatened people with the power to kill and the organizational structure to cover up their crimes. Now they were coming for her. Probably alerted by the daytime team's report that someone was accessing Uncle Henry's files. Ruth implemented Uncle Henry's emergency protocols with hands that remained steady despite her racing heart. She transferred the most critical evidence to a portable drive, secured backup copies in multiple hidden locations, and activated communication equipment that would alert other members of Uncle Henry's network to the threat. The network, she'd learned from his files, consisted of other whistleblowers, former government employees who'd discovered pieces of the conspiracy, and civilians who'd lost family members to Project Clearwater's activities. Uncle Henry had been their central coordinator, collecting and analyzing evidence that individual members couldn't access or interpret on their own. Scout positioned himself at the cabin's single exit, his body language indicating readiness for violence if necessary. Ruth realized that his protective training had been specifically designed for this scenario, defending against human threats rather than wildlife, buying time for escape or evidence destruction rather than simple deterrence. The attackers reached the tower's base and began a coordinated assault designed to prevent escape or communication. Ruth watched them through Uncle Henry's surveillance system as they moved with military precision to secure the site, perimeter, and prepare for vertical assault on the cabin itself. But Uncle Henry had prepared for this contingency. The tower's design included escape routes and defensive measures that weren't visible to casual observation. A zip-line system provided emergency evacuation to a landing zone 200 yards away, concealed by terrain features that made it invisible to ground-based attackers. Emergency communication. Equipment automatically transmitted distress signals and evidence packages to network members who would ensure the information survived even if Ruth didn't. Ruth made her choice in the space of heartbeats. She wouldn't run from Uncle Henry's legacy or abandon the mission he'd entrusted to her. But she also wouldn't sacrifice her life uselessly when survival meant continuing the fight from a position of greater strength. She activated the emergency communication system, uploaded critical evidence to multiple secure servers, and prepared for rapid departure using Uncle Henry's escape route. Scout understood the urgency immediately, positioning himself for the kind of coordinated movement that suggested prior training for exactly this scenario. The zip-line deployment was terrifying but effective, carrying Ruth and Scout to safety while the attackers focused on securing an empty tower. But their escape was just the beginning of a larger confrontation that would determine whether Uncle Henry's decades of evidence collection would bring justice or simply provide another cover-up opportunity for people who'd perfected the art of making inconvenient truths disappear. As Ruth and Scout made their way through the darkness toward her truck, she understood that her quiet mountain life was over. Uncle Henry had passed more than property to her. He'd given her a war to fight, complete with enemies who killed to protect their secrets and allies who risked everything to expose the truth. The only question now was whether she had the strength to honor his sacrifice and continue his mission, regardless of the personal cost. Ruth's cabin felt like a sanctuary under siege. 3 days had passed since her escape from the tower, and every sound in the forest triggered Scout's protective alertness. She'd moved Uncle Henry's most critical evidence to multiple hiding places around her property, following security protocols that seemed increasingly necessary. As the scope of Project Clearwater became clear, the emergency communication system Uncle Henry had installed connected her to a network of allies she'd never known existed. Over the past 72 hours, she'd received encrypted messages from former government employees, investigative journalists, and family members of Project Clearwater victims. Each contact revealed another piece of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the national forests of Washington state. Dr. Sarah Chen, a former CDC researcher, had been the first to make contact. Her message was brief but revealing. "Henry told us about you. We've been waiting for someone with your background to take over coordination. The evidence he collected is just the beginning. We have documentation of similar programs in 12 states. The scope was staggering. What Ruth had assumed was a regional operation revealed itself as a national network of illegal research sites, all operating under the umbrella of classified programs that provided perfect cover for crimes against innocent civilians. Uncle Henry's work in Washington was just one node in a web of systematic human rights violations that had been operating with impunity for decades. Margaret Torres, whose daughter had disappeared during a camping trip in Colorado, provided emotional context that made the clinical documentation devastatingly personal. Maria was 23, studying to be a teacher. She loved the mountains, trusted that the world was basically good. They took that from her and from us. Henry promised that someday there would be justice. Please don't let his promise die with him. The messages arrived through communication equipment that Ruth was still learning to operate. Uncle Henry's technological setup was sophisticated beyond anything she'd imagined, with satellite uplinks, encrypted channels, and fail-safe systems designed to ensure information survived, even if individual operators were eliminated. His paranoia, she was learning, had been entirely justified. Scout had adapted to their new reality with the flexibility that made German Shepherds ideal military working dogs. His protective behavior intensified each day, suggesting ongoing threat assessment that Ruth couldn't consciously detect but had learned to trust completely. When Scout positioned himself between Ruth and the cabin windows, she stayed away from those areas. When his ears pricked toward the tree line, she checked the perimeter cameras Uncle Henry had helped her install years earlier. The cameras revealed regular surveillance of her property, not the clumsy observation she might have detected herself, but professional surveillance that suggested significant resources and careful planning. Ruth found herself grateful for Uncle Henry's security training, realizing that her isolated lifestyle had provided perfect preparation for the operational security requirements of his mission. On the 4th day, Ruth received a message that changed everything. Emergency meeting required. Safe house coordinates attached. Come alone, except for Scout. They know about his training. Others are ready to provide backup if you're willing to take operational command. H would want you to know that we believe his death was not natural. Time is critical. They're accelerating the program. The message came from someone identified only as Cascade, but the authentication codes matched Uncle Henry's documentation perfectly. Ruth studied the coordinates, recognizing a location in the mountains about 30 miles from her cabin, remote enough for security, accessible enough for people who might be coming from considerable distances. Ruth spent an entire day preparing for the meeting, following Uncle Henry's protocols for operational security. She created false trails that would mislead anyone attempting to track her movements, cached emergency supplies at multiple locations along her planned route, and programmed the communication equipment to maintain contact with the network, even if she didn't return. Scout seemed to understand the gravity of their mission. His behavior shifted from protective vigilance to operational readiness. The focused alertness Ruth recognized from police dogs she'd observed during her years living near populated areas. Uncle Henry had clearly trained him for scenarios that went far beyond normal pet protection. Duties. The safe house turned out to be an abandoned ranger station that had been officially decommissioned but was clearly still maintained by someone with access to government resources. Ruth approached the location with extreme caution, following Scout's lead as he checked for threats using senses and training that exceeded her own capabilities. Inside the ranger station, Ruth met the other members of Uncle Henry's network for the first time. Dr. Sarah Chen was a small, intense woman whose scientific background provided credibility that would be essential if they ever managed to expose Project Clearwater to legitimate oversight. Margaret Torres carried photographs of her missing daughter and a determination that reminded Ruth of her own commitment to Michael's memory. Most surprising was James Mitchell, a former Defense Intelligence Agency analyst whose security clearance had been revoked when he'd tried to report Project Clearwater activities through official channels. His insider knowledge of government operations provided tactical intelligence that made the difference between effective resistance and martyrdom. Henry's death wasn't heart failure, Mitchell told the group without preamble. DIA medical examiner found traces of compounds that aren't supposed to exist outside classified research facilities. They killed him because he was preparing to go public with documentation that would have brought down people at the cabinet level. The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. Uncle Henry hadn't died peacefully in his mountain refuge. He'd been murdered by the same people whose crimes he'd spent decades documenting. His inheritance to her wasn't just property and evidence. It was a dying man's desperate attempt to ensure his life's work wouldn't be buried with him. Chen activated a portable computer and began displaying evidence that complemented Uncle Henry's files. Medical data from emergency rooms near Project Clearwater sites showed patterns of injuries and symptoms consistent with experimental drug testing. Financial records revealed budget allocations for wilderness research that had no legitimate scientific justification. Personnel files documented the recruitment of researchers and security staff with backgrounds that suggested willingness to participate in illegal activities. The program is expanding, Chen explained. They're moving beyond isolated test subjects to larger population groups. Urban testing, institutional settings, controlled environments where they can monitor results more systematically. Henry's documentation was the key to understanding their operational structure, but now that he's gone, they think they can accelerate without oversight. Ruth studied the evidence with growing horror and determination. Project Clearwater had evolved from a classified research program into something approaching genocide, systematic elimination of people whose disappearances could be explained away or ignored entirely. The victims weren't random. They were carefully selected for characteristics that made their lives expendable in the eyes of people who viewed human beings as laboratory equipment. Torres spoke for the families who'd lost loved ones to the program. Henry promised us that someday there would be accountability. He said the evidence would speak for the dead when the living couldn't. Now he's dead too, but the evidence remains. The question is whether we have the courage to use it. Mitchell outlined the operational challenges they faced. They have unlimited resources, official cover for their activities, and the ability to eliminate threats through methods that leave no prosecutable evidence. We have documentation, moral authority, and the element of surprise. If we're going to act, it has to be soon, and it has to be comprehensive enough to survive their counterattack. Ruth realized that Uncle Henry had chosen her not just as an inheritor, but as a leader. Her isolation had provided the operational security necessary to protect evidence and coordinate resistance activities. Her lack of official connections meant she couldn't be discredited through bureaucratic manipulation. Most importantly, her personal experience with loss gave her the emotional strength to face an enemy that specialized in destroying lives and covering up their crimes. Scout's sudden alertness interrupted the meeting. Through the ranger station windows, Ruth could see vehicles approaching on the access road, government SUVs moving with the purposeful speed that suggested they'd been discovered. Uncle Henry's network was about to face its first major test. and Ruth found herself in command of a resistance operation she'd never trained for but somehow felt prepared to lead. The escape from the ranger station required the kind of coordinated movement that Uncle Henry had apparently trained the network to execute under extreme pressure. Ruth found herself leading 4 people and scout through terrain that would challenge experienced hikers under normal circumstances. While government vehicles surrounded their meeting location and armed personnel began systematic searches of the area. Mitchell's military background proved invaluable as they moved through the forest using evasion techniques that kept them ahead of their pursuers. Chen carried portable hard drives containing evidence that represented years of documentation, information too valuable to lose, even if it meant sacrificing personal safety. Torres moved with the determined focus of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to fear. Scout ranged ahead of the group, his training allowing him to detect threats and guide them around danger zones that human senses couldn't identify. Ruth realized that Uncle Henry had prepared him for exactly this scenario, functioning as point scout for a resistance cell. Operating in hostile territory, the group made it to the first safe house as darkness fell, reaching a hunting cabin that appeared abandoned but contained supplies and communication equipment that confirmed Uncle Henry's extensive preparation for network operations under siege conditions. Ruth activated the emergency communication protocols, alerting other cells to the government response and implementing security measures designed to protect the broader resistance structure. Over the next several hours, Ruth learned the full scope of what Uncle Henry had built. The network extended across the country, with cells in every state where Project Clearwater had operated. Some members were former government employees who'd discovered pieces of the conspiracy. Others were family members of victims who'd spent years searching for answers about their loved ones' disappearances. A few were journalists and researchers who'd identified patterns in missing persons cases that suggested systematic rather than random explanations. Ruth found herself holding Uncle Henry's memorial wall, dozens of photographs of Project Clearwater victims, each with detailed information about their disappearance and the subsequent cover-up efforts. Looking at their faces, Ruth understood the emotional weight Uncle Henry had carried for decades. These weren't statistics in a classified file. They were real people whose lives had been stolen for research that violated every principle of human decency. Maria Torres smiled from a photograph taken during her last camping trip, unaware that she was walking into a nightmare from which she would never return. Robert Chen, Dr. Chen's brother, had been hiking alone when he encountered Project Clearwater personnel and became another casualty in their ongoing war against inconvenient witnesses. James Patterson, a Forest Service employee, had discovered evidence of illegal activities and was eliminated before he could report his findings to appropriate authorities. Each photograph represented a family destroyed, questions that would never be answered through official channels, and justice that could only come through the kind of resistance operation Uncle Henry had spent his final years organizing. Ruth realized that inheriting his mission meant accepting responsibility for the dead as well as the living, ensuring that their sacrifices wouldn't be forgotten and their killers wouldn't escape accountability. Torres provided personal context that made the clinical evidence devastatingly real. Maria called me the night before she disappeared. She was excited about the hiking trip, planning to take photographs for her teaching portfolio. She wanted to show her students how beautiful the wilderness could be. They turned her love of nature into a trap, used her trust against her. That's what they do. They corrupt everything good about human nature and use it to destroy people. The emotional weight of the stories threatened to overwhelm Ruth, but Scout's steady presence reminded her that Uncle Henry had chosen her for operational leadership, not just emotional support. The network needed someone who could make hard decisions under pressure, coordinate complex operations across multiple states, and maintain security protocols that would protect other members from the fate that had befallen Uncle Henry. Mitchell outlined the scope of the government response to their meeting. They're treating this as a national security threat. Multiple agencies, classified resources, authority to use lethal force if necessary. That tells us they're scared, more scared than they've been since the program started. Uncle Henry's evidence represents an existential threat to people at the highest levels of government. Chen added the scientific perspective. Project Clearwater isn't just about individual crimes. It's about institutional corruption that extends throughout the research establishment. Universities, pharmaceutical companies, government agencies, private contractors, all of them have been complicit in research that would be considered war crimes if conducted on foreign nationals. Exposing the truth means bringing down an entire network of people who've built careers on systematic human rights violations. Ruth studied the evidence with the growing realization that Uncle Henry's mission required more than simple documentation. Exposing Project Clearwater meant confronting an enemy with unlimited resources and decades of experience in covering up evidence and eliminating witnesses. The network would need to be simultaneously comprehensive enough to survive official suppression and focused enough to achieve specific, measurable objectives. The communication equipment brought updates from network cells across the country. Government raids on safe houses in Colorado and Oregon. Suspicious deaths of former employees who'd been identified as potential witnesses. Accelerated Project Clearwater activities that suggested the program was moving to eliminate evidence and dispose of remaining test subjects before exposure became inevitable. Ruth realized they were racing against time. Uncle Henry's death had triggered a defensive response that threatened to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses before the truth could be exposed. The network had perhaps weeks to coordinate a comprehensive revelation that would be too large and too public to suppress through normal government channels. We need to go public. Simultaneously in multiple locations, Ruth told the group, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. Documentation released to multiple media outlets, congressional offices, international human rights organizations, and foreign intelligence services. Make it too big to suppress and too well documented to discredit. Mitchell nodded approvingly. That's exactly what Henry planned, but he needed operational leadership to coordinate the timing. The question is whether we can execute a complex operation while under active suppression by people who specialize in making problems disappear. Ruth looked around the cabin at faces that reflected determination tempered by realistic assessment of the risks they faced. Uncle Henry had chosen each of them for specific capabilities that would be essential to the mission's success. Now they had to prove worthy of his trust and the sacrifice he'd made to preserve evidence that could bring justice to decades of victims. Scout's alert posture reminded Ruth that their enemies were still searching, still closing in, still determined to protect secrets that represented more than individual crimes. They represented a fundamental betrayal of everything government was supposed to protect, carried out by people who'd learned to view human beings as expendable resources in service of classified objectives that violated every principle of civilized society. Ruth discovered Uncle Henry's final secret in the place she least expected, hidden within Scout's collar. Accessible only through a combination of touches that the dog had been trained to recognize and respond to. The revelation came during their third night at the hunting cabin, when Scout's behavior began following patterns that seemed almost like communication attempts. Mitchell had noticed it first. That dog is trying to tell us something. Watch how he positions himself near the communication equipment, then looks at Ruth, then repeats the sequence. That's not random behavior, that's trained signal protocol. Ruth examined Scout's collar more carefully, finding what appeared to be normal identification tags and GPS tracking devices. But when she pressed them in a specific sequence that Scout seemed to encourage through his body language, a hidden compartment opened to reveal a micro-recorder and a set of coordinates that weren't on any of Uncle Henry's maps. The recorder contained Uncle Henry's voice, but the message it held transformed everything Ruth thought she understood about her inheritance. Ruth, if you're hearing this, it means I'm dead, and Scout has successfully guided you through the first phase of operational security protocols. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to accept, but you need to understand the full scope of what you've inherited. I'm not dead. My death was staged to protect both the mission and the people I care about. The heart attack was simulated using compounds that create the appearance of cardiac failure without permanent damage. The funeral was necessary theater to convince Project Clearwater operatives that their primary threat had been eliminated. The reason for this deception is simple. I've been planning the final phase of our operation for years, but it required someone with your specific background and circumstances to serve as operational coordinator. Your isolation provides perfect security for evidence storage and communication coordination. Your lack of official connections means you can't be discredited through bureaucratic manipulation. Most importantly, your personal experience with loss gives you the emotional strength to face an enemy that destroys lives for research purposes. Scout has been trained to guide you through protocols that will lead to our reunion, but only after you've proven capable of leadership under pressure. The network members you've met are real allies with genuine commitment to the mission, but they don't know about my survival. That knowledge is compartmentalized for operational security until the final phase is ready to launch. The coordinates in this message will lead you to my actual location, a facility where I've been preparing comprehensive evidence packages for simultaneous release to over 200 media outlets, government oversight agencies, and international human rights organizations. But reaching that location will require passing through Project Clearwater territory, using skills and knowledge you've developed during the past week of operations. You have a choice to make. Ruth, you can use the evidence you've already collected to expose what you know and return to your peaceful life in the mountains. That would be a significant victory that would save many lives and bring some measure of justice for past victims. Or you can trust my assessment of your capabilities and join me for the final phase, an operation that will destroy Project Clearwater completely and ensure it can never be reconstituted under different names or authorities. If you choose the second option, follow the coordinates with Scout as your guide. He knows the route and the security protocols necessary to reach my location safely. The other network members should continue their preparations for evidence release. They'll be essential to the operation's success, whether you join me or not. Remember that I chose you not just because you're family, but because you're the only person I've ever met who combines the operational security skills necessary for this mission with the moral authority required to see it through to completion. Whatever you decide, know that you've already honored my memory and the memory of everyone who died while I was documenting their killers. Ruth listened to the message 3 times before fully processing its implications. Uncle Henry was alive, had planned her recruitment from the beginning, and was offering her the chance to participate in an operation that would end Project Clearwater forever. But accepting meant leaving the relative safety of network operations and venturing into territory controlled by people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. Scout's behavior during the message playback confirmed its authenticity. His body language showed recognition of Uncle Henry's voice and eagerness to proceed with whatever instructions Ruth chose to follow. The coordinates led to an area deep in the Cascade Mountains, well beyond established trail systems and apparently within the restricted zones that Uncle Henry's maps had identified as Project Clearwater operational territory. Mitchell's reaction was immediate and practical. If he's alive, it changes everything about our tactical situation. We've been operating under the assumption that we're dealing with evidence from a dead whistleblower. But if he's been actively gathering intelligence during his supposed death, he may have information that makes exposure more effective and less dangerous for network members. Chen, focused on the scientific implications. Active. Intelligence gathering means current. Evidence rather than historical documentation. Real-time. Data about ongoing experiments, current victim lists. Operational schedules that would allow law enforcement to prevent crimes, rather than simply documenting them after the fact. Torres spoke for the families. If there's a chance to save people who are still alive, still being held for experimentation, then we have to take it. Maria is gone, but others might not be. That possibility outweighs the risks to ourselves. Ruth realized that Uncle Henry's revelation created both opportunity and obligation. The network had been operating as a resistance cell documenting historical crimes, but Uncle Henry's survival suggested they could function as a rescue operation preventing future victims and potentially saving current. One's eyes, Scout moved to the cabin door and looked back at Ruth with expectant alertness. His body language suggested familiarity with the route. Ahead, an eagerness to proceed with mission protocols that had been suspended during Ruth's recruitment and training phase. The coordinates were approximately 40 miles northeast of their current location, through terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers under ideal conditions. But Uncle Henry's message suggested that Scout knew safe routes and security, protocols that would enable them to reach the facility without detection by Project Clearwater patrols. Ruth made her decision with the certainty that comes from accepting responsibility that can't be delegated or avoided. Uncle Henry had chosen her to lead because she combined the skills necessary for operational success with the moral authority required to see the mission through to completion. Meeting him would require risking everything she'd built during her years of mountain solitude. But abandoning the mission would mean betraying both Uncle Henry's trust and the memory of everyone who died while he was documenting their killers. "I'm going," Ruth told the group. "Uncle Henry is right about the choice. We can expose what we know and achieve partial victory, or we can trust his planning and end this permanently. Scout knows the route, and Uncle Henry has had weeks to prepare for our arrival. The risk is justified by the potential to save lives and ensure this never happens again." Mitchell nodded approvingly. "I'll coordinate network communications and prepare for the evidence release. If you don't check in within 72 hours, we proceed with the exposure operation using what we have." Chen and Torres would return to their home bases to prepare their portions of the evidence release. But all three would maintain communication and be ready to support the final phase operation if Ruth successfully reached Uncle Henry's location. As Ruth prepared for the most dangerous journey of her life, she understood that Uncle Henry's inheritance had been much more than property and evidence. He'd given her the chance to become someone she'd never imagined, a leader in a war against enemies who thought themselves beyond accountability, fighting for victims who could no longer fight for themselves. The journey to Uncle Henry's hidden facility took Ruth and Scout through terrain that belonged more to military operations than civilian hiking. Scout led with the confidence of a dog following familiar routes, but his constant alertness reminded Ruth that they were moving through territory actively patrolled by people who killed to protect their secrets. The first 12 hours took them along ridge, lines that provided concealment from valley approaches while offering observation, points that allowed Scout to detect threats before they became immediate dangers. Ruth followed protocols Uncle Henry had outlined in his final message, moving only during specific time windows when satellite surveillance was minimized and avoiding areas where ground sensors might detect their passage. Scout's training revealed new dimensions as they progressed. He responded to hand signals Ruth didn't remember learning, positioned himself to provide early warning of threats she couldn't detect, and guided her around obstacles that weren't visible until she was close enough to recognize their significance. Uncle Henry had clearly spent years preparing him for this mission, creating a partnership between human intelligence and canine instincts that maximized their chances of reaching the facility undetected. The landscape itself told the story of Project Clearwater's activities. Ruth passed abandoned campsites that showed signs of hasty departure, trail markers that had been deliberately obscured, and areas where natural water sources had been contaminated by runoff from underground facilities. The environmental damage alone represented crimes that would take decades to remediate. But it was the human cost that drove Ruth forward, despite exhaustion and growing awareness of the risks they faced. On the second day, Scout led Ruth to a concealed observation post that Uncle Henry had established to monitor Project Clearwater activities. The position provided a panoramic view of a valley that contained facilities Ruth hadn't known existed. Buildings that appeared on no government maps, roads that connected to no official transportation networks, and security systems that suggested operations requiring the highest levels of classification. Through binoculars, Uncle Henry had cached at the observation post. Ruth watched a convoy of unmarked vehicles delivering what appeared to be supplies and personnel to the main facility. The movement patterns were military in their precision, suggesting coordination between multiple agencies and private contractors. Most disturbing, some of the vehicles appeared to be transporting people rather than equipment, potential victims being delivered for research that violated every principle of human decency. Ruth activated communication equipment hidden at the observation post and received an encrypted message from Uncle Henry. "You're 12 hours from the facility. Tonight's approach window opens at 0200. Scout knows the final route. Trust his guidance completely. Security protocols require radio silence after this transmission until mission completion or abort. Remember that everything we've worked for depends on reaching the evidence cache before they realize I'm still alive." The message included updated intelligence about Project Clearwater activities that made the mission even more urgent. The program was accelerating its operations in response to Uncle Henry's supposed death, moving to eliminate evidence and dispose of remaining test subjects before potential exposure could trigger official investigations. Ruth realized they weren't just racing to expose historical crimes, they were trying to prevent ongoing murders and save people who were still alive, but might not be for much longer. Scout's behavior shifted as they prepared for the final approach. His protective alertness intensified, but he also showed signs of anticipation that suggested familiarity with the destination and eagerness to complete a mission that had been suspended during Ruth's recruitment and training. Uncle Henry had clearly maintained contact with Scout during his stage death, using the dog as a communication channel that Project Clearwater personnel wouldn't recognize or monitor. The descent into the valley required navigating security systems that would have challenged military special operations personnel. Motion sensors, camera networks, automated alarm systems, and patrol routes that covered every obvious approach to the facility. But Uncle Henry had spent years mapping these defenses, creating infiltration routes that exploited blind spots and timing windows that allowed passage without detection. Ruth found herself moving with skills she didn't remember, developing, staying below sensor lines, timing movement to avoid patrol coverage, using terrain features to mask her approach from observation points. Some of the knowledge came from Uncle Henry's training materials, but much of it seemed instinctive, as if years of mountain living had prepared her for exactly this kind of mission. Scout's guidance became crucial as they approached the facility perimeter. He led Ruth through a maze of natural and artificial obstacles to a concealed entrance that appeared to be part of the surrounding rock face. Uncle Henry's engineering skills had created access that was invisible to casual observation but recognizable to someone who knew exactly what to look for. The entrance opened into a tunnel system that connected to an underground facility Uncle Henry had been constructing during his years of supposed isolation. Ruth realized that his fire tower operation had been just the visible portion of a comprehensive intelligence gathering and evidence storage operation that extended far beyond what anyone suspected. The facility contained evidence that represented decades of comprehensive documentation, not just Uncle Henry's work, but materials collected by network members across the country, stolen documents from government facilities, and testimony from survivors who'd escaped Project Clearwater research sites. The scope was staggering, representing a complete record of crimes that stretched back to the program's inception and continued to the present day. Uncle Henry waited in the facility's main operations center, alive but clearly changed by his weeks of isolation and the stress of maintaining his deception. His greeting was brief but emotional, a reunion that acknowledged both the risks Ruth had accepted and the trust he'd placed in her leadership. Capabilities. The final phase requires coordination between our evidence release and law enforcement, operations that will prevent Project Clearwater from destroying evidence or eliminating witnesses, Uncle Henry explained. We have contacts in the FBI, congressional oversight committees, and international human rights organizations who are prepared to act simultaneously once we provide comprehensive documentation and current intelligence about ongoing operations. The evidence cache contained materials that would not only expose Project Clearwater, but provide law enforcement with the information necessary to make arrests, secure facilities, and rescue victims who were still being held for experimentation. Ruth realized that Uncle Henry's mission had evolved beyond simple exposure to active intervention, stopping crimes in progress rather than just documenting historical violations. Scout positioned himself near the communications equipment, his alert posture suggesting ongoing threat assessment despite the security of Uncle Henry's hidden facility. His instincts proved correct when proximity alarms indicated that Project Clearwater personnel were conducting expanded searches of the area, apparently triggered by intelligence suggesting that Uncle Henry's death might not have been genuine. They're beginning to suspect the deception. Uncle Henry told Ruth, "We have perhaps 6 hours before they locate this facility and mount a direct assault. That's enough time to complete the evidence transfer and coordinate the final phase operation. But only if everything proceeds exactly according to a plan." Ruth understood that they were approaching the moment of truth, the culmination of Uncle Henry's decades-long mission and the test of her own commitment to justice for Project Clearwater's victims. The evidence was comprehensive, the network was prepared, and law enforcement contacts were standing by to act. But success required executing a complex operation while under direct threat from enemies who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. The weight of responsibility settled on Ruth's shoulders as she realized that the lives of countless victims, past, present, and future, depended on decisions she would make during the next few hours. Uncle Henry had prepared everything possible, but ultimate success required the kind of moral courage that couldn't be taught or inherited. It had to come from within, sustained by commitment to principles that transcended personal safety or comfort. Scout's steady presence reminded Ruth that she wasn't facing this challenge alone. Uncle Henry's trust, the network's support, and Scout's partnership provided the foundation for courage that individual strength couldn't sustain. The mission was bigger than any single person, but it required individual choices that would determine whether decades of crimes remained hidden or were finally exposed to the justice they deserved. The Dead Man's Switch was Uncle Henry's masterpiece of operational security, a fail-safe system that would automatically release all Project Clearwater evidence to over 200 recipients worldwide if any attempt was made to storm the facility or eliminate the people inside. Ruth learned about its existence just as proximity alarms indicated that government forces were surrounding their location with overwhelming tactical superiority. They can't risk triggering the automatic release, Uncle Henry explained as he activated monitoring systems that showed their facility surrounded by military vehicles and personnel. But they also can't allow us to complete the manual evidence transfer that would give law enforcement everything needed to shut down the program and arrest the perpetrators. We're in a standoff that they can't win through force. Scout positioned himself near the facility's main entrance, his body language indicating readiness for confrontation, while his training kept him focused on protecting Ruth and Uncle Henry rather than engaging threats directly. Years of preparation had taught him to function as an early warning system and protective asset rather than an attack dog. His value lay in keeping his human partners alive long enough to complete their mission. The tactical situation was complex but not hopeless. Project Clearwater operatives had superior numbers and equipment, but they were constrained by the need to prevent evidence release, while Uncle Henry and Ruth retained the ability to trigger the dead man's switch at any moment. The stalemate gave them leverage, but it also created pressure to resolve the confrontation before their enemies. Found ways to neutralize the failsafe system, Ruth activated the communication equipment and sent encrypted messages to network members across the country. Final phase initiated. Maintain evidence release readiness. Facility under siege but dead man's switch active. Proceed with media coordination on schedule regardless of outcome here. The response was immediate and supportive. Mitchell confirmed that FBI contacts were prepared to act the moment they received comprehensive evidence packages. Chen verified that international human rights organizations were standing by to ensure the story received global attention that would prevent domestic suppression. Torres spoke for the families. "We're ready. Whatever happens, the truth will finally be told." Uncle Henry's planning had anticipated this scenario. The dead man's switch wasn't just a deterrent. It was the culmination of a strategy that made Project Clearwater's suppression tactics counterproductive. Any attempt to silence the whistleblowers would trigger the very exposure they were trying to prevent, while allowing the evidence release to proceed would accomplish the same objective through voluntary rather than automatic means. They're requesting communication, Uncle Henry reported as encrypted messages arrived through channels that suggested coordination at the highest levels of government. Someone with authority to negotiate wants to discuss terms for resolving this situation without triggering the automatic release. Ruth read the message with growing amazement at the scope of panic their operation had generated, prepared to discuss immunity arrangements and program termination in exchange for evidence retention and personnel security. Request immediate response to prevent escalation with unpredictable consequences for all parties. The offer revealed how thoroughly Uncle Henry's strategy had cornered Project Clearwater's leadership. They were offering to shut down the entire program and provide immunity for whistleblowers in exchange for keeping the evidence secret, an admission that exposure would destroy not just the program, but the careers and freedom of everyone involved in its operation. Uncle Henry's response was immediate and non-negotiable. No deals, no immunity, no continued secrecy. The evidence goes public within the hour, regardless of what you offer or threaten. The only choice you have is whether to face justice voluntarily or be dragged to it by law enforcement operations you can't suppress or control. The rejection of negotiation triggered immediate escalation. Ruth watched through the facility's surveillance system as tactical teams prepared for assault operations designed to neutralize the dead man's switch before it could trigger the evidence release. But Uncle Henry's engineering skills had created multiple redundancies that would require simultaneously disabling systems spread across several states, a logistical impossibility given the time constraints they faced. Scout's alertness intensified as the external threat became more immediate, but his training kept him focused on protection rather than aggression. Ruth realized that Uncle Henry had prepared him for this specific scenario, teaching him to function as a guardian angel for people engaged in work that transcended normal risk assessment. The communication equipment brought updates from network members who were watching the confrontation unfold through news reports and official channels. Government agencies were scrambling to contain a situation that threatened to expose decades of illegal activities involving multiple administrations and countless civilian casualties. The panic in Washington suggested that Uncle Henry's evidence was even more comprehensive and damaging than Ruth had realized. "They can't win this," Uncle Henry told Ruth with quiet satisfaction. 30 years of evidence collection, network building, and strategic planning have created a situation where their only options are exposure or admission of guilt. Either way, Project Clearwater ends tonight, and the people responsible face consequences they've avoided for decades. Ruth felt the weight of history as she realized they were approaching the moment when years of hidden crimes would finally be brought into the light of public scrutiny and legal accountability. Uncle Henry's emergence from his hidden facility marked the turning point that transformed a tactical standoff into a moral reckoning that Project Clearwater's leadership couldn't suppress or control. Ruth watched through the surveillance system as her uncle walked calmly toward the perimeter where armed personnel had expected to find dead whistleblowers rather than living witnesses prepared to testify about decades of government crimes. Scout accompanied Uncle Henry with the confident bearing of a dog who understood that his training was finally being put to its intended use. Years of preparation had created a partnership between human intelligence and canine loyalty that provided protection. No amount of tactical superiority could overcome the moral authority that comes from speaking truth to power regardless of personal consequences. The response from Project Clearwater operatives was immediate confusion followed by grudging recognition that their mission parameters had fundamentally changed. Eliminating dead whistleblowers' evidence was one thing, but murdering living witnesses in full view of media attention that was already beginning to focus on their operations would create political consequences that extended far beyond program security concerns. Ruth activated the communication equipment for what Uncle Henry called the final broadcast. Simultaneous transmission of comprehensive evidence to law enforcement agencies, media outlets, congressional oversight committees, and international human rights organizations. The dead man's switch had served its purpose as deterrent and leverage, but manual transmission ensured that the evidence reached recipients with the context and authentication necessary to trigger immediate action. The evidence release was devastating in its scope and precision. Detailed documentation of 43 murders disguised as missing persons cases. Financial records showing budget allocations for illegal research that violated both domestic and international law. Personnel files identifying everyone from security contractors to cabinet-level officials who'd participated in or provided cover for Project Clearwater activities. Medical records documenting experiments that constituted torture under any reasonable definition of the term. Mitchell's voice came through the communication system with barely controlled excitement. FBI field offices in 12 states are initiating simultaneous raids on Project Clearwater facilities. Congressional oversight committees are demanding immediate hearings. International media is picking up the story, with headlines that can't be suppressed or discredited. It's working. The whole system is collapsing under the weight of evidence they can't deny or explain away, Chen reported from her medical contacts. Hospital records are being subpoenaed to trace victims who survived initial experiments. Research facilities are being secured to prevent evidence destruction. The scientific community is demanding investigation of every researcher who participated in illegal human experimentation. This isn't just exposure, it's comprehensive accountability for decades of crimes. Torres spoke for the families with tears in her voice. The memorial wall is going public. Every victim will be remembered. Every family will finally have answers. Every death will finally have meaning. Henry kept his promise. There is justice for the people they tried to erase from history. Uncle Henry's confrontation with Project Clearwater's leadership became a master class in moral authority overcoming tactical superiority. Ruth watched as armed personnel found themselves unable to threaten someone whose evidence had already triggered the very investigations they'd spent decades preventing. Their weapons became irrelevant when the target had already achieved the objectives that made personal safety secondary to mission completion. The negotiation that followed was less discussion than capitulation. Project Clearwater's leadership realized they faced a choice between voluntary cooperation with investigation and inevitable prosecution for crimes that could no longer be hidden or denied. Uncle Henry's comprehensive documentation had created a situation where denial was impossible and suppression would only add obstruction charges to an already overwhelming case for prosecution. Scout's reunion with Ruth provided the emotional high point that balanced the clinical precision of evidence presentation with the human cost of Project Clearwater's activities. The dog's joy at completing a mission that had defined his entire adult life reflected the satisfaction of people who'd spent years working toward justice that finally seemed achievable. The facility that had been Uncle Henry's secret headquarters became the center of a law enforcement operation that would continue for months as investigators processed evidence and identified victims, perpetrators and witnesses. But the immediate objective had been achieved. Project Clearwater's activities were exposed, its leadership was under arrest, and its victims were finally receiving the recognition and justice their sacrifices deserved. Ruth realized that Uncle Henry's inheritance had been more than property or evidence. It had been the chance to become someone she'd never imagined possible. From isolated mountain woman to operational coordinator of a resistance network that brought down a criminal conspiracy spanning decades and multiple states. The transformation felt both impossible and inevitable, as if her entire life had been preparation for this moment of moral courage under pressure that most people never face. The government conspiracy that had seemed invulnerable hours earlier collapsed with stunning speed once exposure became inevitable. Officials who'd spent careers protecting classified programs found themselves racing to provide evidence and testimony that might reduce their sentences. Private contractors discovered that immunity agreements weren't worth the paper they were printed on when crimes violated international law. Researchers learned that academic credentials provided no protection from prosecution for participating in illegal human experimentation. Uncle Henry's strategy had been perfect in its simplicity: create evidence so comprehensive that denial was impossible, then trigger release through methods that made suppression counterproductive. 30 years of patient documentation had created the foundation for justice that satisfied both legal requirements and moral imperatives that transcended normal political considerations. 6 months after Project Clearwater's exposure, Ruth stood in the memorial garden she'd created at the base of Uncle Henry's fire tower, reading names of victims whose lives had finally received the recognition their deaths deserved. The garden occupied the site where Uncle Henry's secret facility had been located, transformed from a center of resistance operations into a place of remembrance and healing that honored both the dead and the living, who'd fought to bring them justice. Each stone in the memorial bore the name of someone who'd disappeared into Project Clearwater's experimental programs, along with photographs and personal details that restored their humanity after decades of existing only as classified file numbers. Maria Torres smiled from a granite marker that described her dreams of teaching and her love of wilderness photography. Robert Chen Stone honored a scientist whose curiosity about government research had cost him his life, but ultimately contributed to exposing the crimes he'd died. Investigating Scout patrolled the memorial garden with the satisfied air of a dog whose life's work had been completed successfully. His protective instincts remained sharp, but they were now focused on welcoming visitors rather than detecting threats. Uncle Henry had integrated him into the memorial's daily operations, training him to provide comfort to family members who came to honor their lost loved ones and to assist researchers who were documenting the full scope of Project Clearwater's activities. The transformation of the fire tower from hidden observation post to public memorial had required extensive renovation, but Uncle Henry's engineering skills proved as valuable for construction as they'd been for concealment. The tower now served as an education center where visitors could learn about government accountability, citizen oversight, and the price of allowing classified programs to operate without meaningful supervision. Ruth's role had evolved from operational coordinator to public advocate, a position she'd never sought but found surprisingly fulfilling. Her testimony before congressional committees had been crucial in securing legislation that strengthened oversight of classified research programs. Her work with international human rights organizations had helped establish protocols for investigating similar programs in other countries. Most importantly, her partnership with victims' families had created support networks that provided healing for people who'd spent decades searching for answers about their loved ones. Fate's, Uncle Henry's, reintegration into society had been gradual but successful. His expertise in intelligence analysis and operational security made him valuable to legitimate oversight organizations, while his experience with resistance operations provided insights that helped other whistleblowers navigate the complex process of exposing government crimes. The fire tower had become his official residence, a symbolic return to the open monitoring that represented the opposite of the secrecy that had enabled Project Clearwater's crimes. The legal proceedings that followed Project Clearwater's exposure had exceeded everyone's expectations for both scope and effectiveness. Over 200 individuals faced charges ranging from murder and kidnapping to conspiracy and civil rights violations. The evidence Uncle Henry had collected proved so comprehensive that denial became impossible and plea bargaining became the only viable defense strategy for most defendants. Dr. Sarah Chen had testified about the medical aspects of Project Clearwater's experiments, providing expert analysis that helped juries understand the systematic torture that had been disguised as research. Her work with survivor treatment programs had begun healing processes that extended far beyond legal proceedings, addressing the psychological trauma that affected both direct victims and their families. Margaret Torres had become the unofficial spokesperson for victims' families, her dignity and determination helping transform public perception of Project Clearwater from abstract policy debate to personal tragedy that demanded accountability. Her advocacy had been instrumental in securing compensation for families and establishing memorial programs that ensured victims would be remembered as individuals rather than statistics. James Mitchell's intelligence background had proven crucial in documenting the full extent of Project Clearwater's network and identifying international connections that led to investigations in multiple countries. His work with congressional oversight committees had resulted in reforms that strengthened protection for future whistleblowers and created transparency requirements that made similar programs much more difficult to implement and sustain. The environmental restoration of areas damaged by Project Clearwater's activities had become a secondary mission that attracted support from conservation organizations and environmental justice advocates. Ruth found herself coordinating cleanup efforts that addressed decades of contamination while creating educational opportunities that helped people understand the connection between environmental protection and human rights. Scouts continued health and vitality at 10 years old reflected the quality of care Uncle Henry had provided throughout his training and the satisfaction that came from completing a mission that had defined his adult life. His interactions with memorial visitors had become legendary among people who worked with therapy animals. His ability to provide comfort while maintaining protective awareness created an atmosphere of safety that enabled healing conversations that might otherwise have been too difficult to sustain. The Fire Tower Memorial had attracted visitors from around the world, including researchers studying government accountability, families dealing with similar losses, and activists working to prevent future human rights violations. Ruth had learned to share Uncle Henry's story in ways that honored his sacrifice while encouraging others to maintain vigilance against the kind of institutional corruption that had enabled Project Clearwater's decades of operation. Ruth's personal transformation from isolated mountain woman to public advocate felt both dramatic and natural, as if her years of solitude had been preparation for the kind of moral leadership that transcended normal comfort zones. Her relationship with Scout had deepened into a partnership that combined his protective instincts with her growing confidence in public speaking and advocacy work. The legacy of Uncle Henry's mission extended far beyond Project Clearwater's specific crimes to broader questions about citizen oversight, government accountability, and the responsibility of individuals to speak truth to power, regardless of personal cost. The memorial garden served as a reminder that democracy required eternal vigilance and that the price of freedom included willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional failures. As Ruth watched the sun set over the mountains that had sheltered both Uncle Henry's resistance operations and her own journey toward purpose beyond personal comfort, she understood that some inheritances transcend property or money to encompass responsibility for ensuring that future generations never face the kind of systematic injustice that Project Clearwater had represented. The tower that had once hidden secrets now stood as a beacon of transparency, in proof that individual courage could ultimately overcome institutional corruption when sustained by communities committed to justice and truth.